There is surely no better place to start than by talking about this scene.
End it. Now.
Joel, get up. Joel, fucking get up. Please stop. Please don't do this. Joel, please get up. No! Fucking kill you! No! Fucking kill you! No!
This was the moment that we all knew, for better or worse, that Part 2 wasn't going to be what we expected. A make or break moment for just about every fan of the series. Judging by the reactions I've seen online, for the most part it was certainly more break than make. However, after watching this, I remained very much on the fence. I was willing to give Naughty Dog the benefit of the doubt. Having completed the story now, I think the only boiled down summary I can piece together from an experience that felt so polished but still left me so wanting is, Part 2 is uniquely ambitious, and at times even sublime, but ultimately falls flat by the time the credits roll. My aim with this video is to attempt to explain why. When Part 2 was released in June, I was intending only to play the game at some point. I love the first game, but have a natural skepticism towards sequels to just about anything these days. That said, Naughty Dog as a developer has a glittering reputation. Some would say as clean and aspirational a reputation as Rockstar or CD Projekt Red, which have in recent years become the lauded darlings of the industry. In fact, I would say that the most interesting thing about Part 2 is not anything to do with the game itself, but how its reception appears to have marred what was the developer's otherwise stellar regard. From a narrative standpoint, a lot of fans did not enjoy this game, and a good number of them outright hated it. Let's paint in some background here. The Last of Us was, even in a landscape as vast as what the video game industry has become, something of a lightning-in-a-bottle title. The plot was not wholly original, but more than competent. The gameplay was at once comfortably familiar and fringed with touches of originality, and the tone achieved a rare quality of being able to find fragile moments of beauty in a world ravaged by violence. It was an instant classic for a combination of these reasons, but what most people will say made it feel unique was its characters, and more specifically the relationship between Joel and Ellie. A tired, jaded old man learning to care again for someone who essentially becomes his adoptive daughter, the young girl headstrong and funny and quirky in a world that has raised most to be morose, cynical, and self-serving. The biggest difference between the two games isn't actually their narrative structure or execution, though they are markedly different, but I think more so their core message. The clear and definite message in the first game was, in my mind, that survival is paramount, a message that fits neatly into this universe Naughty Dog has built. However, Part 2 feels as though the writers went into the drafting phase by saying, set everything else aside, this is the story we want to tell now, and service that vision at the expense of the message that came before, and to a point at the expense of the characters' arcs. They have turned what was a survival story into a revenge story, and that is ultimately where I think the dissonance between the two parts lies. I'm reminded here of Stake Bentley's excellent video titled Metal Gear Solid 4 was a Mistake, in which he coins the phrase sequel dissonance. a symptom that explains, at least in part, why this title failed to appeal to fans. The reason Part 2 feels so lacking in some ways and superb in others can be boiled down to the execution of two narrative attributes: substance and structure. Now, the substance actually, and I'm speaking exclusively about the story here, is in some ways surprisingly profound. The full details of what actually happened on the night of the dance are well withheld. The slow reveal of Ellie realizing what happened at St. Mary's in flashbacks is compelling, and we as the player knowing what Abby will find when she returns to the aquarium on the third day are all expertly well crafted and well delivered. That said, however, complaints that the game is too long has been expressed ad nauseum by now, and it is too long. Subplot is brought center stage time and again, and some narrative threads come across as obvious or don't actually go anywhere. I suspected from the time that Joel was killed that, okay, maybe Abby's dad was the surgeon or something, and was, in piecing this together quite passively, disappointed when the answer really was that simple. I was also curious to see what sort of character the ominous and oft-mentioned Isaac would become, particularly after all the hint-dropping of gruesome and methodical torture. But after all that, he just ends up getting shot before we really know anything much about him. Narratively speaking, him getting unexpectedly killed works fine, but when his character and role in the story are never returned to, all that build-up becomes something of a red herring. While I have exampled that the structure is in places executed well, for the most part it feels divergent, bloated, and I think most importantly, disconnected. Almost every narrative subplot is interesting in its own right, but leaves the narrative crux, which is of course the showdown in the theatre, in a limbo that stretches its tension so thin that we are practically begging the story to get on with it. My feeling is that the ambition in Part 2's structure is largely achieved, overlong as it is, but it's the story that's told, the substance, that fails in its level of ambition. While the message in the first game was relatively clear, as much as it had nuances that left aspects of that message open to interpretation, the only definite message in Part 2 is violence begets violence, and then essentially does nothing to link back to the message in the first game. People who enjoy stories and the intricate mechanisms that make great stories really powerful know that while themes are important, it is essentially a narrative sin to beat someone over the head with one. Part 2 unfortunately beats this single drum of revenge is a poison theme so heavily, it's hard to hear the notes of just about any other instrument in its orchestra. The original Last of Us espoused hope in a world where no one had any reason to expect it. Part 2 seems intent on stripping that hope down until little is left, and all who remain know only regret. It feels almost like a video game interpretation of Shakespeare's Hamlet, but without any of the iconic prose. Revenge is all-consuming, and every person you know or care about in your pursuit of it will die. Like the first game, this story is nothing new, but where the first game succeeded in overcoming a lack of original plot with original character, Part 2 uses that original strength to service its theme, not only stifling it from what fans ultimately cared about, but also of anything nearly as compelling as what it thinks it achieves. A quick personal side note. I think the reason the first game was so powerful to me was because it fueled a desire to emulate a relationship just like what Ellie and Joel had. I want a daughter like Ellie one day. At least that's what the game made me feel. It made me want to raise someone who is headstrong and self-assured and who swears like a sailor, because she would be all the things I never quite achieved when I was that age. And all this emotion, this paternal desire, is expressed through this game only in flashbacks. I echo the sentiments here of both Young Ye and Writing on Games videos when I say that the Wyoming museum scene is everything I really wanted from this sequel. To see more of Joel and Ellie expressing how grateful they have been to have been a part of each other's lives. It establishes their connection with greater ability than most of what the first installment ever achieved, which is no easy feat. Though I've felt similar emotions from books and in movies, a scene from a video game has strengthened my desire to recreate something akin in my own life, and that is about as strong as storytelling can really get. One thing I think the game does exceptionally well is how it draws a parallel between this heartwarming scene and the adolescence and the weight behind Joel's choice that begin to drive Ellie and Joel further apart. I also think that the cutaways to reminiscences of Joel are expertly framed, timed, and executed throughout, to the point that I really could have loved this game even with Joel's death exactly as it was. It was the execution of most everything that came after that alienated my experience. Neil Druckmann, the game's director, stated before its release that he knew some fans would dislike Part 2, which comes as little surprise to me. Though he also said, and I quote, "I'd rather have people passionately hate it than just be like, yeah, it was okay." Unfortunately, Part 2 is just okay, and that's why I'm disappointed. Despite the gripes I've mentioned, I do see a part of the vision attempted in this story. What I think it achieves that the first game didn't is that it truly earns its name. It's about the last of us, the last of the human race. It's not just about Joel, it's not just about Ellie. What the game has tried to do, and I think has in some ways done superbly, and in other ways could have achieved better if it had trimmed a lot of the fluff, is make its world and inhabitants feel dynamic and real. Now, of course, the first game made its surroundings feel real, and certainly made our lead cast feel real. But Part 2 establishes that, like in life, no one is a hero all of the time. Every story has two sides. To be human is to be imperfect. However, the fact of the matter is, we all know this, and you don't need to build a 25-hour narrative dedicated to it. I respect it when writers want to tell a story that isn't necessarily what an audience wants to hear. Vision is more important than fan service. I'm a firm believer in that. But to put character aside and focus on theme, ambitious as that may be, means very little when your original success was predicated on character. Naughty Dog told us a story they wanted to tell, not the story we wanted to hear. As a writer myself, I empathise, but only in part. It is possible to strike a balance. What they ultimately did was tell a narrative that was a sequel in structure, but something wholly different in spirit. That is why this game is so divisive, and why, ultimately, its vaulting ambition leaves many, if not most, disappointed.